I've been on a new professional journey for 5 or 6 years now, and it's been tremendously challenging, and it still is tremendously challenging. And when I sometimes want to throw in the towel or question myself too much, or I do play kind of the tape forward and from that old man vantage point, look back and go, Petty, how do you want to have lived this portion of your life? And every time I ask myself that question, I go, I want to remember myself as courageous, all in, and just going for it, whatever that meant in that moment. This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. Today's guest is none other than yours truly, thanks to the creativity and generosity of my guest on episode 38, Natalie Niksa. It was Natalie's idea to turn the mic around, so to speak, and interview me. I was excited about the idea right away. I'm not actually 100% clear on why I was excited, but I try to follow my energy closely. And when excitement shows up, I do my best to pay attention to it and act on it. So, I took Natalie up on her offer, and today's episode is the result. Natalie shares her reasons for interviewing me in the beginning of our conversation, so I won't touch on those now. I will acknowledge Natalie's courage in taking on the role of interviewer, though. She's a whiz in the culinary world, but the podcast interviewer world is new territory altogether. I think you'll agree that she does a great job. In this conversation, through the lens of my own story, we discuss curiosity as a superpower, recapturing childhood dreams, how to use mortality as a motivator in daily life, how to address foreboding joy when it shows up, how to use this podcast to get after it in life, and more. Along the way, I'm more open and vulnerable than I've ever been before in any public forum. And though I had a bit of a vulnerability hangover after we recorded, I'm glad to share honestly from my story, because I know it will be useful and meaningful to someone else out there. Without further ado, let's jump in.
The intention for today's episode is really to hear from the man behind the mic, Andrew Petty himself, basically humanizing this man behind this podcast, because I think sometimes we forget that there's another human on the other end, where we're so used to just pushing play. So I wanted to take this opportunity for people tuning in for the first time to really understand how much takeaway is actually in these episodes. And for the listener, I have no skin in the game other than being a fan too. So I'm just going to name that this is super cool, Andrew, that you're willing to not only allow me to take the mic, but also that you're not prepared for this. I'm just going to repeat that in case anyone's multitasking while listening, that neither of us have any idea where this conversation may lead. And I'm going to also acknowledge how vulnerable this is or would be for anyone, but particularly you, because in previous episodes, you've been so forthcoming in sharing your relationship with anxiety. And I think a lot of folks might be a bit uncomfortable and expectantly self-conscious to have their platform be taken over and to have the questions you normally ask others be turned to you. So kudos for playing along.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was psyched when you said you were interested in doing it, because I thought that does sound fun. And now that we're doing it, like I told you just before we got on the air, I was like, I'm kind of all over the place. I don't know. I'm more comfortable on the other side of the mic, so to speak. I like asking the questions sometimes more than answering. So I'm excited for this opportunity, because like you, I don't know precisely where it will head, but I'm excited about wherever it goes.
So let's kick it off by exploring a bit of your curiosity process, as it's clearly led you to so many of the great conversations you've had in these episodes. In particular, you mention in one of your episodes using discomfort to become the people we were made to be and to live the lives we were meant to live. Through your understanding that everything is a pathway to helping others, can you share with us a bit of your own process of curiosity and what tools help you to remain creatively free to produce the collateral that you're willing to share with so many?
That's quite a question. The curiosity bit is what sticks out to me the most. I think you're asking about maybe how curiosity is a guide for me in what I do. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I feel that curiosity is 100% a guide for you, and you use it to allow yourself to meet so many unique people, hold space for those people, connect those people with all of these other mouse crumbs. So I just want the listener to really understand your process of curiosity? Because it takes vulnerability to be curious.
I think the first thing I would say is, for me, curiosity isn't a process. It's something I've become more aware of in adulthood as an innate quality that is probably primary in the way that I operate in the world. And over the past couple of years, I've kind of been playing around with statements to describe what I do in the world. And often I'll ask a coaching client or a friend or whomever, what do you do? In the Western world, especially, we're accustomed to answering, well, I'm a this or I'm a that. I'm a farmer, I'm an accountant, I'm a this. But what I'm really looking for is, no, what do you do in the world? What changes in that space because Natalie is there is one way of getting at what we do in the world, I believe. And it's one way of getting at what we've always done in the world just by virtue of our existence and our presence. And as I've talked about some on other episodes of the podcast, my adult life has been a lot about a pain-driven process of self-discovery in order, as Jordan Peterson puts it, to put myself together better. I love that way of saying it, by the way, because I think all of us have the choice, if we'd like, to put ourselves together just a little bit better. And one other word might be maturity, but I actually like the word putting ourselves together, that phrase, better, because I think anyone can relate to the idea of putting yourself together. Any of us can relate to a time when we're not put together all that well, or recall a time in our past when we were not as well put together as we are today. So that process has led me to a point a few years ago. I was like, what do I do in the world that helps me understand my place in the world and my path and my purpose in the world? And as I played around with it, I realized that curiosity was a primary impulse for me. There's a lot of ways in which my critical problem solving isn't all that sharp or all that fast, but curiosity paired with intuition end up being a reasonable facsimile for critical problem solving and any other of those other related skills. And so as I learned that critical problem solving, at least in a rapid way, wasn't useful for me, but saw that curiosity and intuition often achieved a similar result, I began to and saw that those were innate parts of me. I began to really lean into those. And the statement I came up with was, and it's still basically my working statement, and it may evolve over time, I expect it will, but is that I express my curiosity about the human condition in the world we live in through meaningful conversations. And if you were to look back over the timeline of my life, you would find evidence of that sprinkled throughout childhood, teenage years, young adulthood. It's just always been there. It's just now as an adult, having to, again, put yourself together and figure out how to keep a roof over your head and live in a community and have a family. Now that has more impact. To understand what I do in the world then makes it deployable. It helps me understand better who I am, and then understanding better who I am, what I uniquely can do in the world. And when I say what I uniquely can do in the world, I don't mean that Andrew's going to do something that in kind has never been done before, but I might do something in a way that's never been done before with people for whom that thing has never been done and have an impact that's never been made. So that's my initial response, is that for me, it's not a process. It's an innate impulse that, having identified it, I now use as sort of a superpower. It's kind of like I follow my curiosity. My curiosity leads me to good places. My curiosity leads me to people sensing that I have a genuine interest in who they are, and I do. And then it leads me to just ask whatever question comes up next.
And in a way, it's almost as if curiosity allows for infinite possibility. It's almost as if there's like a synonymous relationship with that essence of your childlike spirit combined with your love of connecting with others and helping others and allowing for anything to really be possible through that curious nature.
Yeah, and I think curiosity creates dialogue, and dialogue tends to generate insight. And insight is a precursor to transformation. Curiosity is maybe the catalyst that allows some of that to occur. And of course, it works really well for me in my chosen path professionally and relationally as well. I'm an introvert, but for those with whom I do engage often, it's a valuable tool.
It also allows you to hold space for people, because just by being curious allows for someone else their story to be heard, which is such a gift in and of itself. So you've said in the past that you tend to think best when you're moving, starting with the micro, just getting up and just getting out of whatever the routine has been can be vulnerable, right? So many people, I think, day after day go by that what they intended to do to start doesn't happen. And so there's so much in these episodes where you discuss daring to dream again. And I think that when we talk about dreaming, it really is just a matter of taking that first step. Would you be willing to share with us what dreams you're trying to recapture lately?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to just pause for a minute and chew on that. Dreams I've been trying to recapture. On a meta level, certainly more childlikeness. Not childishness necessarily, but childlikeness in simplicity and in lack of filter. And I don't mean I run around saying whatever I want, doing whatever I want, but not adorning my childlikeness with all kinds of adult trappings that often obscure the real gold that's there. And for me, that's a very personal journey too, because when anxiety became debilitating in my early 20s, and thankfully it's no longer debilitating, but it was then when it hit that way, it was maybe the final nail in the coffin for me at that point in my life of childlikeness, because it became a desperate struggle to stay alive, because the anxiety was so bad that, I did at one point in my mind say, if this doesn't stop soon, then I can't live any longer. And so, and it was, Jordan Peterson talks about crisis. This will be a very, very rough paraphrase, but new things showing up our life unexpected, especially ones that are unwelcome, is an intense and very, very difficult form of chaos to deal with. And it deconstructs the whole framework that we had put in place to understand how we navigate life. And that's what happened to me when the anxiety showed up, because I literally thought I was going to die any moment. And so it really put the final nail in the coffin of childlikeness for a time. And as I've first done battle with the anxiety, and then more recently accepted and allowed it to come along, I have begun to really attempt to recapture childlikeness and to learn to want things with abandon and without judgment or censorship, to want and expect good things from the world and the universe, and in my worldview from God, and to ask big things of him. And there's a passage in scripture that says, it's an ending to a thought, but it says, to him who is able to do exceedingly and abundantly beyond what we can ask or imagine, to him be the glory, so on and so forth. And so for me, an ongoing effort is, well, if God's saying he'll do more and can do more than I can imagine, then I'm going to dream as big as I can. I think we even touched on this in your episode when you were interviewed, Natalie. And then other things that come to mind when you ask that question is, like, I still feel as if the real Andrew isn't known. Now, I don't know what that means exactly. That may be, well, I won't qualify it. I'll just say, I feel like the real Andrew isn't known yet to me and to the world. And parts of the real Andrew that are within me that I think aren't yet made known to the world are the drummer, the surfer, the guitar player, the artist, the documentarian. Those are all dreams that capture my imagination, and I can inhabit those dreams in my heart and my mind and see myself living that way, and it feels like me. And so there's ways in which the life that I currently live in some ways still don't feel quite like me. But that isn't the same as to say that I'm living an inauthentic or counterfeit life, because I think the process of putting ourselves together over the course of our adulthood, if we are willing to become more and more consciously engaged in it, is to uncover who we truly are. Listened to a summary of a book recently by, I think her name was Lindsay Gibson, and it's talking about emotional maturity. And she said, we come into adulthood with a role self that's different than our true self. And the role self evolves in our family of origin, and it often obscures the true self, because in our role self, we're putting on clothing, so to speak, that doesn't fit us naturally or wouldn't be our natural choice in order to function within that family of origin and to perform a role. And so I think part of the work of adulthood is figuring out where we have adorned ourselves with garments that aren't really us, and putting them aside so that who we really are can be made better known to the world. So I think I am more my true self today than I've ever been, but there's more to be known and more to be made available in the world. Guitar I would like to recapture, because I played guitar for quite a while and then put it away for a while. Kids came along and all that, and it just happened. So those are some of them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And, you regularly talk about living life with more guts and abandon. And I would imagine that that evolves and adapts with how our landscapes change. Like you becoming a dad, that's a change of a landscape of the Andrew Petty that's a surfer, right? Like you're living in Colorado. I don't think you're surfing, any waves out there, right?
You can surf behind a boat. I haven't done that yet, but you can.
But I would imagine that idea of living life with more guts and abandon doesn't necessarily have to just be linear from a physical standpoint of being adventurous. I think that living with more guts and abandon can be anything where you feel that sense of, I really want to do this. I just can't muster up the oomph to get up and out, to just move. Like we were just saying, that vulnerability of just starting can be the micro step for individuals. I love that the theme behind the podcast is really using mortality as a motivator. And it's consciously or perhaps even uncomfortably using mortality as a motivator on a daily and weekly basis. Can you tell the audience, do you think about it daily? Do you think about it weekly? Or is it something that's just become a knowing that it's going to happen for all of us, that we're all going to die? How do you combine that with, living with more guts and abandon and using that mortality as a motivator? And how do you pass that down to your children without, implementing fear and really just the power of the present moment of let's be grateful for now?
I do live with awareness of mortality most days, but it's not for the reasons you might suspect. That's largely derived from the kind of anxiety that I experience. The awareness of death comes part and parcel with the kind of anxiety that I more typically experience than others. So, and that's actually, again, part of why this podcast exists, part of why the Graveyard Group Masterminds exist, is because my hyper-awareness of mortality led me to believe that maybe there are others who don't think about it enough, and in thinking about it more would find greater freedom to become the people they were made to be and live the lives they were made to live. And it turns out it works that way. And that's not original. People have been, the Stoics and many others have been talking about that for eons. Every spiritual and philosophical tradition has something to say about the value of contemplating mortality. And we've gotten so good in the modern age of insulating ourselves from the reality of mortality through convenience, through extended life, through greater health care and all those kinds of things, that especially in the Western world, death feels like a surprise when it shows up. And Rob Rigg, who was on this podcast many episodes ago, is the coroner here in Routt County. And it was a fascinating conversation because he said, to a person, when he's on scene at a fatality, they always say, I didn't see this coming. I never expected this. I think on some level, all of us might still say that no matter how hard we work on expecting mortality, but because it is still the ultimate surprise. But I think we do have some really good work to do in the West to go, no, it's coming. Don't fritter your life away. Don't get into autopilot, because it's painful for mortality to show up and to realize all of the woulda, coulda, shouldas. And I said this before in an episode, but a resident at a retirement community, an elderly gentleman, said to a client of mine, I didn't when I coulda, now I can't when I wanna. And that just to me is like a knife in the heart to get to that point in your life and to look back and to realize that. And when you get to that point and realize that, goose is cooked. You're all done. So mortality is on my mind every day, but largely because of the anxiety. But then as I've engaged in this practice of the podcast and the Graveyard Group, I found you can approximate the pressure of a crisis, the pressure of an awareness of your mortality through just intentional practice. And the way it translates into my life is in decision making. Am I going to do this or that? And maybe it's about, am I going to spend another half hour working on my computer, or am I going to go on a walk because my son just came in and said, can you go for a hike? And it's not as if every time I will choose to go on a walk with my son, because there's a time for work and there's a time for play, but I at least pause more than I think I might have in the past and ask myself, when I'm that elderly gentleman, for example, in the retirement community, and I'm thinking about the way I spent my time. What will I remember most? And it's going to be the walks with my son. It's not going to be the extra half hour on my computer. 100% guarantee it. It's not going to be what I accomplished professionally. It's going to be the quality of the relationships that I made and the investments that I made in them. It's going to be the courage with which I lived my life. So that's another way that it informs me is when I've been on a new professional journey for 5 or 6 years now, and it's been tremendously challenging, and it still is tremendously challenging. And when I sometimes want to throw in the towel or question myself too much, or I do play kind of the tape forward and from that old man vantage point, look back and go, Petty, how do you want to have lived this portion of your life? And every time I ask myself that question, I go, I want to remember myself as courageous, all in, and just going for it, whatever that meant in that moment. It can be adventuresome stuff, off doing cool stuff that is fun to do, but it can be being courageous in relationships. And that can be starting a different kind of conversation with a family member or a loved one or a friend when you're in a relational rut. That's one of the most courageous things I think we can do in life is to try to bump a relationship out of its existing rut and explore new territory. So that could be the form of courage that you embrace. So it is very much with me, and I'm really grateful for the podcast, the Graveyard Groups. I'm grateful in certain ways for the anxiety, for bringing that to the forefront of my heart and mind, because it encourages me to, I live in a ski town, so ski metaphors make sense, to put my shins on the front of my boots and attack the mountain, lean downhill. Because the irony is that, continuing the skiing metaphor, when we lean back on the backs of our skis and ski tentatively, we ski poorly and we get hurt more often. And, as in skiing, so in life, I think if we lean forward and attack life, then life has a way of coming alongside to support us in the journey. And there's all kinds of language put to that in philosophical and spiritual traditions, the power of intention and manifestation, all that kind of stuff. And I think simply what we're looking at is our orientation to life and to the world. Are we leaning into it? Are we leaning back from it? And I'm much more interested in maintaining a courageous orientation to life. If you saw me, you would know that that's my intent, because courage for all of us looks different. And all of us have different fears for which courage is the remedy. Unfortunately, we don't get to dispense with fear in life, and there's many things to be genuinely fearful of. And so I don't think a useful objective is to rid ourselves of fear. And Jordan Peterson says this way too, it's not about getting less fearful, it's about getting more brave. And so courage building to me is a key life skill to engage in. How'd that do in answering your question? I'm not sure.
I love how it's a full circle, because we were talking about curiosity. And I think that we, can say that curiosity really is synonymous with this childlike energy. And children, when they are supported, when they are feeling safe, they are naturally brave. They ultimately want to be leaning forward and not stepping back. They want to be all in. So it really is a beautiful, connection to our previous conversation. And you mentioned the Graveyard Group, you mentioned the podcasts. I want to now allow you to just share with the audience your professional landscape of what you've created to be an ecosystem of sorts, because the process of your Graveyard Group, your podcast, they feed one another. And can you tell us a little bit about how you use each of the platforms and how the platforms are really designed to support people you may know or yet to discover, conversations you've had and the ones that are yet to come?
Yeah, maybe I'll start by mentioning which ones came first and then how I began to discover that they served one another. Coaching on an individual basis and in a corporate environment came first. And as I began to do more coaching, I began to concurrently chew on this mortality idea as my relationship with the anxiety changed. And it was then that, and you may have had experiences like this before, I was out walking somewhere, and you mentioned earlier that most of my best thinking comes from movement, and that was certainly the case here. The phrase, the Graveyard Group, came to mind, just seemingly from out of nowhere. And I was like, oh, I don't know what that is, but I like that. That feels like something. And so I began to kind of research, what happens when people consciously contemplate their mortality. And there's a lot of research showing what happens. A lot of good things happen when they do that. Some challenging things can happen sometimes too, but a lot of good things happen. So the graveyard group eventually got started. It took a little bit of time to go from concept to its initial incarnation. And about a year into the first graveyard group's existence, maybe a year and change, I don't remember exactly, but I was out on a run and suddenly was really interested in, I was chewing on this. I don't even know where it came from, but basically I got really curious about people that live here in Steamboat. Not a few people in mind, like, what are they about? That, for me, that's probably the chief question that my curiosity leads me to ask is like, what are they about? Like, what's Natalie about? What are you about? That's what I want to know. And I realized there's people in town. I had that question in my mind about like, what are they about? And so I thought, oh, well, maybe I could just start interviewing them, and I'd share it on a podcast, and it'd be interesting to Steamboat folks. And I know enough about myself to know that when I have an idea, it's important to take some step right away, or else often it stays in idea la la land and never comes to fruition. So I hired a podcast coach, Tim Wahlberg and Valerie McTavish, who are amazing. Look them up if you're interested in getting your own podcast going. I still work with them today, and Tim's my editor. And as they kind of heard the idea, they very gently and firmly said, that's a nice idea, Andrew. And we just don't think that has a lot of meat to it in terms of actual interest. Tell us about the rest of your business. So I started talking about the graveyard group, and they went, now that sounds interesting. Long story short, the podcast became another way of expressing the graveyard group mentality, which is tap into the power of your mortality to become the person you were made to be and live the life you're made to live. And so that's where the podcast came from. So now I have these three parts in my business ecosystem. I've got the coaching that I do with individuals and groups. I've got the graveyard group mastermind. And then after a long, slow, painful process, the podcast came to life. And as I began to do all three concurrently, I realized that they fed each other. So the solo episodes especially become a place for me to work a thought to a conclusion. I don't mean the conclusion, because I don't think I've ever delivered the final word on anything. But the solo episodes represent an attempt to bring a thought to a conclusion that may be useful for the audience and actionable for the audience. And often the kernel of the idea for that solo episode comes from my conversations with clients, whether it's in a one-on-one setting or in the graveyard group. And I go, man, this is coming up a lot. For example, the one about conversations, how's the conversation going, came out of multiple instances of talking with individuals and in the mastermind about difficult conversations people were often either having badly or not having at all. And I realized that our relationships are like one big conversation stretched over years. And the quality of that conversation over time is directly related to the quality of the individual conversations that are contained within it. Some of them are verbal and some of them are nonverbal. So that kind of got me going on that idea, and I was able to bring it to a conclusion that was deliverable to the audience. Now that that's in place with one-on-one clients, with friends, with anybody that I interact with, people in the graveyard group, when I find that someone maybe could benefit from that thought or that idea, then I can pass it on to them. And so it's sort of a force multiplier, to use a military term. It multiplies the potential impact of an idea I might deliver to more people more quickly than it otherwise would. And I've just found that the three work well together. And I've also found I have an antagonistic relationship with each of them some of the time. My wife pointed out a couple of months ago that, 1 week I'll be high on coaching, the next week I'll be high on the podcast, and some throes of misery around coaching. So I think it's actually really helpful that there's sort of this three-legged stool or a three-part ecosystem, because it allows me, and this is part of how I'm made too, I do not like repetition and tedium. And so to be able to turn my attention and energy to a different part of my ecosystem when one part is sort of languishing or my relationship with it is not what I'd like it to be is really a life ring too.
So I worked with you one-on-one from the coaching perspective, and I definitely am a fan of the podcast. If you are comfortable, I would love to set up a hypothetical question as a coach. You willing to play?
Sure, yeah.
So you said that the graveyard group was just really this thought that kind of came in, you received it, and it was just like I'm going to explore this. This feels right. Brene Brown talks about a term that we don't really use a lot, which is foreboding. And she says foreboding joy. And it's like that moment when all of the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed, all the ducks are in the road, and you are just feeling really, really, really good, high on life. And then all of a sudden it's like, uh-oh, this feels too good. Something bad must be around the corner. So if you had a client that was experiencing this, what sort of questions would you ask, and how would you help this individual from staying in the moment of receiving the great idea, feeling good? And it almost also applies to how you get on the other side of anxiety when it resurfaces again.
Foreboding joy is certainly a thing, and there are a lot of various sources from it, and sometimes foreboding joy comes from people's story, because often it was too good to be true. And so it's important, not, in my opinion, not to dismiss, well, anything that someone would bring up, because if they brought it up, it's important to them. But it's also important not to dismiss that as a lack of courage or a presence of timidity, because foreboding joy can be real for someone, because maybe in their childhood, good things were promised to them and then regularly not delivered upon. And so they don't know what to count on. What is solid? What is real? What can I actually hope for and go for? I'm debating whether I want to share this part or not. I will. It was almost a vision that came to my mind. I'm trying to paint an example of how foreboding joy has shown up in my life, even when I was about to get married to my wonderful wife, Karis. I was in many ways a wreck because I was afraid that I was making a mistake, not because of her. And Karis, I want you to know that's for sure. And we've talked about this, but because I was always afraid I was making mistakes. I was afraid to strike out on my own. And this was the biggest striking out on my own that I had ever undertaken. And so I was kind of wrapped around the axle about it. And in my mind's eye, I had this vivid vision of me as a little boy. This didn't actually occur, but it was as if it had, running, pumping my fists as hard as I could, and running as hard as I could, and looking over my shoulder and asking my dad, "Is this okay? Is this okay?" So there was an element deep within me of suspicion that it was okay to make choices on my own and to pursue and to break away and live the life that I wanted to live. And that's just been part and parcel of the putting back together that I've had to do as an adult, is to continue to affirm that, yes, it is okay to strike out. It is okay to pave your own way. It is okay to use this great sweeping permission of adulthood to become who you'd like to be. All that to say that, foreboding joy is not to be taken lightly. And sometimes it is also a representation of resistance, which is a word I borrow from Stephen Pressfield, capital R resistance, that shows up almost the very moment we decide to do something that, number one, is exciting to us and is in some way more vulnerable and more exposing of our real dreams and desires than something has been before. And so it can be a clever way of our psychology tricking us into not taking the next step. And so with a client, I don't know precisely the question I would ask, because it would have to be within the context of their story and understanding. And hopefully we're having that moment where foreboding joy shows up. I have a lot of context about their story and the things that they want and where they've come from and the things that really bog them down. So I don't know precisely what question I would ask. I just know that it would be a moment to literally and figuratively pause and together consider what that's about, and to consider, is this resistance that can be labeled such and combated as such, or is there something else going on too that might need to be addressed? Because again, maybe some of your history has led you to moments like this and you've stopped before, but this could be the moment where you take a step forward like never before. So I'm sorry that I don't have specific questions, but I think that's my best way to get at how I would handle that moment when it showed up with a client.
Over the course of the people that you've interviewed, some of the topics that you cover are uncomfortable. And I would say that they're uncomfortable for no other reason than that they're really relatable. And the content in the 40 or so episodes, I feel, could really be applied over the course of an entire year before being really fully integrated in terms of the lesson, the message. Especially because we're all operating so differently. We're processing in our own time. We take in information just at our own rate. My next question is really, if we're consuming so much information, when do we actually take the time to digest what we're consuming? We can always see and hear more than we can possibly do as well. So where would you suggest people to start when they're coming to this podcast to get after their life, live the way that they're meant to be living today, where would you suggest people to even begin? Because you talked about this in the fishbowl, it's just so massive.
Yeah, the global fish pond episode. Yeah. My knee-jerk response would be simply look at the episodes that are there and look at titles that appeal to you. And if there's one that appeals to you a little bit more than the others, then listen to that one. And if it stops being interesting, stop listening to that one and pick up a different one. They do relate to one another significantly, but that wasn't by design. That's, I think, just because the themes that the interviews contain and the themes that are especially interesting to me, I think they can't help but relate. So you're not going to be at a disadvantage if you start at episode 37 and then go back to episode 2. And I don't know that you're at a particular advantage if you start at episode 1 and work your way all the way through. And you just did this. Like that was one of the gifts you've given me recently, was you said, hey, I'll go through all of them and jot down some notes so you kind of have a record of what you've got there. And I was like, heck yeah, that'd be amazing.
I also just wanted to call out too that the first number episode you chose was my favorite number without even knowing it.
Oh, really? Oh, cool. That's cool. And you were fatigued by the end of that. Like you're like, okay, I said I was going to do this, so I'm going to do it. But man, this is, whew.
So wait, let's just give a little context. So I went through, so I was listening to the episodes, and the way that I come to a podcast, I think that the reason why I wanted to offer this gift of time and opportunity for the mic to be turned towards Andrew today is because so many people come to podcasts and they listen to the most recent one. And I think that if people were only listening to one podcast, I just wanted at least there to be some intrigue before, whether they dismiss it or whether they continue and look further. I decided to listen from 1 to, at that point, it was 37. Now, that's manageable. And your podcasts, what I like about them is some of them are so bite-sized. They're really, they're practical in the sense that you don't, carry on and on and on. And they also have so many extraordinary tools where you link them to other episodes. So if you really resonate with something in an episode, you can then carry on with whatever the suggested next episode is. What you're saying in terms of fatigue is the amount of people's stories and the amount of true life wisdom, tools, just insight was so profound. It was fatigue in the sense of my cup overrunneth.
Right. I get it. And that's actually a great point, because I think we know when the cup is full and there's no room for any more. I had a time about a year ago where I had been consuming quite a bit of podcasts and books and articles, and I just began to realize that I can't do it anymore. It was actually beginning, because to your point earlier, we can read and hear way more than we can ever actually hope to actualize in our own lives. And I think I'd reached a point of diminishing returns where hearing more was only revealing how much of what I'd already consumed wasn't in place in my life in any substantial way. And so I just really stopped for a while. I did not listen to any podcasts. I didn't read anything new. I didn't order any new books. And that's part of actually where the episode around the inner voice came from, because I realized I've allowed so many other voices to enter my space and my head and my heart that it's become unclear to me where my voice is in the mix. And I wanted to recapture that and probably capture it some way, in some sense, in a primary and for the first time in my life. And so that's part of where that episode came out of. So I think we know internally, if we pay attention internally to kind of how we're relating to the material that we're consuming, I think we'll get a sense for whether or not it may be great content. And I've actually told people similarly before, like I think you need to be done reading. You need to be done listening, because you need to hear you now. And so stay in tune to how you're relating to the content, because if it's crowding out your own voice, and if you're beginning to despair of your ability to put all of these things into practice, then stop and find the few things that are especially meaningful to you and figure out how you can begin to do something with those. And that's my hope for anyone listening to the podcast, that no matter if it's an interview or a short solo episode, that they would be willing to consider, okay, I've heard something in here that struck me. What's one thing I could do with it? Because On those like CSI shows and stuff, when there's a kidnapping, they always talk about, I think it's the first 48 hours are the most critical. And if you don't find someone within the first 48 hours, then the chances of finding them go way, way, way down. It's actually somewhat true too in the case of human change. When we have an insight, there's this magical window of time within which we have the opportunity to act upon that insight and then get the benefit of whatever transformation can result from it. And if we let that insight languish and it stays an insight merely, it's not that it's without value, but it's without its potential value. It's without its ultimate value if we don't do something with it. So again, just to summarize, I would say, if you haven't listened to this podcast much and want to, then just look through the catalog of episodes, and whichever one piques your interest or looks more interesting than another one, try that one. And if you get bored with it, turn it off halfway through and find another one. And the whole catalog of episodes can be treated that way because they do relate to one another, but not in a way that makes it unintelligible if you don't go from start to finish in order.
You mentioned the coroner earlier, and I am just going to say that was one of my absolute favorite episodes. I can't recall. 13 and 18 are two of my favorites. So I'm just going to put that out there right now, 13 and 18. All right, two final questions, Andrew, which I feel like you answered, in ways. So it will be interesting to hear how you come to the answer in this moment. This is a Peter Crone question. Who would you be and what becomes available in the absence of all of your concerns?
I love that question. I hadn't heard that one before. Peter Crone. Okay, cool. The absence of all my concerns.
Who would you be and what becomes available?
I think I would be quite a bit more fun than I often am. I think my family finds me to be fun, and occasionally others find me to be fun. But because of the complexity of my psychology, and I'm not saying that my psychology is any more complex than anyone else's, but just the complexity I find in my own psychology and relating to myself and the anxiety I experience, it can limit my availability. It limits the availability of the Andrew within because there's a multitasking occurring. And so when you say without my concerns, I immediately think without the presence of anxiety just sort of lurking and doing what it does, which is compromise me. It takes resources away that otherwise would be available. So I think I would be more carefree. I would be more fun. I would be sillier more often. I would be less careful. I would trust myself more completely. I would trust that I've got this, I can do it. And that's a common thing for me, is to instinctively not trust that I've got it or can do it. What was the second part of the question?
What becomes available?
Available. Yeah. I think it's the thing that strikes me most is largely the silliness, the childlikeness, the carefreeness that occasionally I experience, and very often I don't. And that's sad to me. And I grieve that actually, and want very badly to make more of that available for my own enjoyment and for the enjoyment of others. I've got a good sense of humor when it's available. I have a quick wit when it's available. And those that are closest to me know it best, and others don't. And also, I think there would be maybe more drumming, more surfing, more documentary creation. It's one of the pains of being a solopreneur, in my case, trying to do stuff on my own and having more ideas than I'm able to execute on. And so one of my deep longings is to figure out how to assemble a team with me and around me who can bring to life more of the ideas and creativity that I have. And not only that I have, but complement and supplement what I have to make it something even better. So I think that is another answer to that. Part of the answer to that question would be without the concern that literally consumes hours of resources just in the management of it, because there's a cycle for me of darkness and light, shrinking and expanding. And I think many can relate to that on some level. It's just especially painful and compromising cycle for me. And maybe folks like me who work on their own and create on their own experience that more than others. I think Stephen Pressfield would certainly say that's the case. It's part of the artist's journey. And I think I am an artist and a creative person at heart, more than maybe just about anything else.
Well, what's really so beautiful about this is that the goal of taking this time was really to humanize this podcast, because I think so oftentimes we just push play and are like, all right, we're just, taking up space, listening to someone's story, listening to a voice that we find pleasant, X, Y, or Z. And you have shared so much of your beingness. And I just want, the listener to realize that that's beneath every single episode, multiple energies, just like you and me. And I think that there's nothing more powerful than that human connection. So, one last question. You ready?
Bring it. Yeah, I'm ready.
In a few words, how would you like to be remembered?
I would like to be remembered as courageous. I'd like to be remembered as compassionate. Intrepid comes to mind. That's kind of an antiquated word. It's not used very much these days. But what that means to me is persistent in doing in this world and discovering and doing what I was especially made to do. That's at the very center of my heart and my mind. One of my greatest fears is failure to fulfill my potential. And I think that has some, that fear has some utility and also has some harm that comes along with it. But I'm always interested in what I'm made to do and doing that to the best of my ability. So I want to be thought of as intrepid in that sense, always pursuing that. And I want to be remembered by my wife and kids as someone who was intensely committed to their well-being, because I am. And I feel the emotion of that even as I say it, because I love them dearly. And I consider it the chief project of my life to help them understand themselves and deploy themselves in the world to the best of their ability. And I think some of the emotion comes from me because that's been the chief battlefield of my existence. And, because of pain that occurred in my life that I'm not aware that I did anything to cause, but it was nonetheless mine to resolve or to relate to. And it's not precisely that I want to spare them from pain, because pain has utility and pain is also part of life. But I do want them to be better situated than I found myself to be in adulthood, to understand themselves, enjoy themselves, and live the life they were made to live. And so I appreciate that question, because it helps me just to remember that of all the ways I might measure myself, that's the one that is most important to me. And thankfully, at this point in my life, I can say that they are well and they are expanding and they are becoming better equipped to do that. Not perfectly, of course, because I'm imperfect and so is my wife and so are they, but they're moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for being willing to share and record in your own words. You are gonna die, but you're not dead yet. So get after it.
Insight plus action equals transformation. It's a simple formula for human change. Put it to work in your own life right now. What's one insight you gained about yourself from this episode? What's one thing you'd be willing to do with that insight today, before the magical window of opportunity closes? Imagine yourself at 95, rocking on the porch of your final home, reflecting on the life you've lived, aware that mortality is no longer just an abstraction, but a very present reality. And imagine that from the moment you listened to this episode until that day on your porch, you committed to taking courageous and decisive action whenever you gained a new insight. And imagine that all those individual actions conspired over time to create a life you are immensely proud of, with few, if any, lingering regrets. What does that feel like? How badly do you want that future? Now, imagine the opposite scenario. Instead of taking courageous and decisive action, you reveled in the insights, but shrank away when the moment of action came. Your life story is riddled with what could have been, unfulfilled dreams, and half-hearted desires. Relationships suffered when you avoided the hard conversations or decided to bang out more emails. And who you could have been will never now really be known. What does that future feel like? How badly do you want to avoid that future? Those are two extremes to make the point, but there's a point to be made here nonetheless. Today is the day. Tomorrow never comes, but death most certainly does. Let the inevitability of your mortality fill your sails with wind and your hearts with courage to be who you were made to be and live the life you were made to live. To learn more about the Graveyard Group, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live on a weekly basis, visit digdeepwinbig.com/The Graveyard Group. I'll include links to other episodes and resources mentioned in this episode in the show notes. Connect with me on Facebook or Instagram at Andrew Petty Coach. Visit digdeepwinbig.com or email me at andrew@digdeepwinbig.com. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to follow this show, and I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.